Afternoon, everybody. I'm going to try and give you a bit of advice so that you can prepare for the essay that I'm going to set you. This is available in a downloadable file, which you should be able to find easily enough on the class page. I do want you to spend some time planning your essay. I do want you to use your knowledge from the information that we studied on collectivization a couple of weeks ago. I want you to handwrite your essay unless you would normally use a computer, and I want you to scan and upload your essay using the method that I've shown you in the last 24 hours or so. It's due by the end of the weekend, not too late please, and I will get back to you with some feedback as quick as I can. When I say if you'd usually use a computer, I mean in exams, not just for homework or for preference. Right, let's think about this question then. To what extent had collectivization achieved its aims by 1941? Let's think about the question as if we're going to approach it the way our friend from that grammar school in Pakistan would do. What are the key things? First thing, it's talking about collectivization. So not the 5-year plans, not the purges, not the NEP, not war communism, none of that stuff. Collectivization. And that means that you need to be finishing in 1941, because that's what the question tells you to do, but you probably need to be starting in 1927, maybe 1928. You wouldn't want to go too much further than that, because otherwise you'd be into the NEP, and you wouldn't want to go later than that because it had already started by 1928. In order to answer this question, you've got to know what the aims were. So before you go any further, you need to clarify for yourself what were the aims of collectivization. You've got lots of information about this in the booklet already, but shortlist it. Go back through those notes and pick out what you would consider to be the top, let's say 6 or 7 aims, and then gradually refine it down to the top 4 or 5, depending on how much you think there is to say about each of those aims and how interesting they are and how important they're going to be in the argument that you want to create. Then you need to think about the achievements of collectivization. In other words, how successful was collectivization? You've got loads of really dense information in there as well. Think about different measures for collectivization. Think about success as grain production and grain supply. There is a difference there. Think about how much was being produced compared with how much was being supplied to the towns and cities. It's perfectly possible that grain production went up, but not all of it made its way to the people in the towns and the cities. Equally, it's also possible that grain production went down, but a larger proportion made its way into the towns and cities. So think about what your measures are. Also think about successful for whom. What does this question imply? The question says, to what extent had collectivization achieved its aims? Well, who designed collectivization? Whose aims are important here? Yes, lots and lots of peasants died as a result of it, but is that relevant to a question about the aims of collectivization? It's probably not the most important factor. So whose aims? It's probably more complicated than just saying Stalin's aims. It's probably the aims of Stalin and the state, or maybe Stalin and the party state. So think about that as well. When you've got that far, you can weigh up collectivization's successes against collectivization's failures. This is the first sort of easiest, simplest approach to the essay, really. You'd have a short introduction, and then you'd have at least 2 paragraphs on its successes and at least 2 paragraphs on its failures. If you think overall it's more successful than failure, you'd probably have 3 successes paragraphs, and they'd probably come first. If you think it's more of a failure, then you'd do it the other way round. Then you'd need a conclusion, of course. This is a simple, straightforward, easy way of approaching the question, and this is the categories approach. And so there's nothing wrong with it at all. You could write a perfectly good essay this way. You could combine a categories and a chronological approach by looking to see whether you see any patterns. Once you've figured out what the successes and what the failures were, look to see if you spot any chronological patterns. For example, you might conclude that it's devastatingly successful in the first couple of years, but overall a failure by 1941, or the other way around. You might conclude that there's millions of people starving to death at the beginning, but by the end it has achieved its goals of guaranteeing the food supply to the towns and cities, and therefore overall by 1941 it has succeeded. That would be up to you. And now we start to get on to a slightly more sophisticated view of this, because the question asks not just weigh up the successes and the failures, it asks to what extent it had achieved its aims. So we're not just looking for a kind of balance sheet, successes versus failures. We're looking for something that's a bit more nuanced, maybe something that looks a bit more like a spectrum. So you might think about laying out the outcomes of collectivization on a spectrum, and you might conclude that although there are 2 successes and 2 failures, for argument's sake, overall the balance is more towards the failure end than towards the success end. So although there were some things which were moderate successes, overall your conclusion is going to be that it was more of a failure. Now, what we're starting to get into is the language of success and failure. So you might want to think about this. Varying your sentence starters, not only to make your essay more interesting, but also to make your argument more sophisticated. So you could talk about aims that were not reached at all, goals that were not fulfilled, targets that were barely achieved. Comment that in some areas no progress was made towards the aims or towards the goals or the targets. At the other end, you might say that some aims were totally fulfilled. Some things were fully achieved. Some goals were realized in full. In the middle, though, you might have some things that are only partially achieved. So think about this and think about making sure that you match up the right sentence starters with the right points. So in other words, it wouldn't be appropriate really to say that the aim of improving the lives of the peasantry was only partially achieved, because I don't think anyone would say that it was even partially achieved, because it was misery for the peasants. So just be a little bit careful and try and think about how you describe each of these things. When you get to your conclusion, you're going to need to answer the question in full. And so, as I suggested during our Zoom meeting earlier on, I think it's helpful to try to boil down your answer to a single sentence. So you could say, if you're taking the blue categories approach, you might say, overall, by the end, collectivization had achieved most of Stalin's aims, but had not achieved, and then you'd specify the thing that hadn't been achieved. Or if you're taking a chronological approach, you might point out the difference between short-term successes or achievement of short-term aims but not long-term aims, for example. Alternatively, you could say something like, while it would be true to say that collectivization achieved this, perhaps had achieved this in the short term, it would not be accurate to suggest that it had successfully achieved these other things. So think about how you could boil it down to one sentence if you can. I hope that helps. Get in touch if you get really stuck. Otherwise, give it a good go, and I hope to see you soon.